It's a week of emotional whiplash here in Israel. Tears, joy, and dread all at once. On one side, the unthinkable has happened. Hostages have come home, rescued from the depths of Hamas captivity. Families are whole again. A nation exhales. But just as celebrations begin, a shadow creeps in, because the price was steep. 2,000 Palestinian prisoners, including convicted murderers and masterminds of terror, now walk free, cheered as heroes by the very societies that raised them. Hamas flaunts its defiance, having violated the ceasefire terms almost as soon as they were inked. And alongside the embrace of our brothers returned to us, the quiet question echoes: will we look back and wonder at the cost? This isn't the first time Israel has paid dearly to bring its people home, and if history is any guide, we may yet pay. Have we secured peace or merely delayed the next nightmare? Today we sit down with Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody, author of Ethics of Our Fighters, a Jewish view on war and morality, to wrestle with one of the most agonizing dilemmas that a society can face. When life is sacred, how do you measure its worth? Now, before we begin, let me be clear about our purpose today. The show isn't here to pass judgment on the events of this week, events that are raw, emotional, deeply complex, and far from resolved. What we are here to do is something just as important: to step back and examine larger questions about the value that we place on human life, about the impossible moral choices that leadership demands in times of war, and the eternal dilemma, specifically in the Jewish tradition, of what it means to negotiate with evil. I'm Aylana Meisel, and this is Basic Law. And now, Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody, I'd like to welcome you to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here with you.
It's great to see you. And thank you for joining us on such short notice. So let's just open the show, because we're going to be looking at two different legal traditions and trying to see how they balance values differently. With just kind of a broad overview of how Jewish tradition sees what we're going to call hostage deals, and how it's perceived and talked about in international law.
Yeah, sounds great. I mean, it's so important to have these types of conversations, particularly when it's raw, but also afterwards when you want to reflect on with the importance of what needs to be done, has been done, needs to be done in the future. I think in many ways that we didn't do this in the past after the Gilad Shalit deal in 2014, which released over 1,000 prisoners for one soldier. And so it's so important to do this today. And, you're right that the traditions are a little bit different here. The Western legal tradition of international human law, humanitarian law, and Jewish law, but there are a lot of similarities as well. Within Jewish law, there's a real stress on the importance of redeeming captives. This is an idea which, unfortunately, Jews had to deal with for many, many centuries. You see it already in the 2nd century CE, after the Romans conquered Jerusalem, and afterwards in the fall of the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the 2nd century. And Jews are taken captive a lot of ways, and there's a big stress on redeeming captives. And you've seen this throughout the war, in fact, how many in Israeli society have quoted passages from the ancient Jewish Talmud, the great book of Jewish law, which stresses how there's no greater mitzvah, no greater good deed than redeeming a captive. But it's interesting that the Talmud also says you cannot redeem a captive for more than the regular price. And they ask, well, why? Remember, then they're talking about monetary redemption. They're paying for these captives, sort of freeing them from the slave market. And the answer given is, A, it could take away the deplete communal resources if you spend too much on them. And B, if you are willing to pay so much to bring them home, you end up encouraging future hostage taking as well. And so there's really a balance here of values that I think Jewish tradition has been trying to navigate for many centuries on this issue. When it comes to international humanitarian law, so we're used to the idea of prisoners of war and prisoner exchanges, usually after war, but sometimes during a war. This was really an invention primarily of the 20th century. Beforehand, it wasn't a given that prisoners of war be treated humanely. Many of them were killed or never returned. In the 20th century, though, there's a big push to try to um, govern the humane treatment of hostages or prisoners of war, excuse me, during hostilities, and also to facilitate exchanges following the cessation of hostilities. It really culminated in 1949 after World War II with the Geneva Convention that tried to sort of regulate and push this along. But it's in many ways a combination of legal factors, but also ultimately diplomacy was driving things a lot of times, as what does diplomatically make sense for different parties in different cases. And of course, political pressures as well. How important is it to get back these captives? What are the potential losses? Sort of those types of strategic calculations. Jewish law wasn't thinking in terms of strategy for many centuries. I think this is one of the challenges we have in Israel today is we quote these Jewish legal passages, which I certainly think are very important, but that wasn't about global military strategy. That was just about ad hoc. How do we get these people home when we don't have power? The dilemmas today, in many ways, are to bring about Jewish values into the context of a very complex geopolitical reality.
Well, let me take you back just one step before we open that, because that will make most of our show. But when you talk about like pidyon shvuim, which the retrieval of captives for quote unquote a price, this was a price that was set by captors. I mean, how would you evaluate what a price was?
Yeah, I mean, usually it was dictated by the slave market. I mean, that's sort of how these people could be. Many captives, people that were taken captive were being sold on slave markets. So certainly many times that was sort of like the going price. Now, sometimes when Jews in particular, this is a particularly happens in the medieval period, are targeted for the sake of getting money from the Jewish community. So then, yes, it could become just sort of just like the Jewish market, what's sort of the Jewish captive market. And here we have a couple of famous examples, particularly of prestigious rabbis who were taken captive. The most famous of which is a man by the name of Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg from the 13th century, who sort of told his community, "Don't overpay for me, because if you do that, every rabbi is going to be a target." But by and large, it seems that despite all of the Talmudic warnings of not paying too much for a captive to bring them home, the practice was to do whatever it takes to bring people home, with the feeling being that their lives are at risk. This isn't just a matter of leaving them in captivity for a little bit longer. The lives are at risk. And given the political situation of the Jews in Europe and other places, we just got to save whoever we can save. But that's of course a very different reality from the state of Israel. We're not talking about money. You're talking about prisoner swaps, and you're dealing with this country that has power, has military power, and you have to think about how to sort of implement those values in a very different political context.
And is that something that Israel does?
Well, it's a good question because Israel is not governed, of course, by Jewish law, but there's a Jewish legal influence, cultural influence. And I'd say that many times people selectively sort of quote different Talmudic passages depending on their political orientation or their strategic orientation on the matter. So, recently you see all of a sudden people quoting Maimonides and others saying there's no greater mitzvah than to redeem captives. But then you have others who quote the Mishnah, the Talmudic passage, which says, for tikkun olam, for repairing the world, we have to make sure that we don't overpay. And I think really ultimately, you have a situation where you have to balance different values. And part of what I think the depth of the conversation needs to be is to recognize there are different values here at stake that relate to core Jewish values, relate to short-term security of very small group of people, which is important to us. We care about that, but also the long-term security of the collective. And those are serious values which have to be balanced and brought to the table. If we can bring those values to the table and have in-depth conversations, we'll be in a much better place than sort of selectively quoting this, rabbi or this passage, whoever it might be.
And how would you you touched on it in your first answer, but how would you, in the most concise way, sum up the different ways in which Jewish and Western law are balance the values in these questions?
So I think in Western law, there's this general understanding that we have prisoners of war, and prisoners of war should be exchanged after hostilities. By the way, that also means that they could be kept in captivity for a long time, depending on the length of the war, which happened certainly during World War II. It happened in Israel's War of Independence. People were held in Jordanian captivity, for example, for many months. But this is an idea which says, okay, there's no reason and that we shouldn't exchange prisoners of war, of soldiers after hostilities. And if a soldier is so wounded that they can never come back to practicing war, to being involved in the warfare, then that exchange can be done even in the midst of war. We're seeing that right now, by the way, between Russia and Ukraine. There have been a number of prisoner exchanges already in the midst of a war in this case. And that's sort of the proper treatment. What gets really complicated on our circumstance in Israel is that we're not necessarily dealing here with prisoners of war. I
Right,
mean, some
that would really gonna be the question, because with civilians
yeah, so, I
and
mean,
terrorists.
basically, we're dealing with civilians, first of all, who Hamas took captive. Many of the people, at least, that were taken captive on October 7th were civilians, were not either active soldiers or even the army. Of course, we had children and all sorts of older people in their 80s or whatnot. And so that's one, of course, very important distinction. This was really just hostage taking, which is clearly forbidden by international law. That's actually not really in dispute. This was a war crime from Hamas. And the second factor is that the people that Israel is being asked to release, many of whom weren't fighters who were taken captive during the Iron Swords War, but were terrorists who were captured by Israel over past many years, or just captured for terrorist activities. And I think it's pretty clear that they're not included in sort of the treaties of prisoners of war. One of the big distinctions that we say about prisoners of war is you have to be fighting in a uniform in order to be considered a soldier who's governed by the laws of international conflict or even non-international conflict. And that, of course, is one of the things that Hamas doesn't do. And so Israel is being asked here, not so much as a matter of international law to release Palestinian prisoners, but in the matter of diplomacy or political needs or some form of moral urgency on Israeli part to release many, many murderers, terrorists, who don't fall into these laws of war, but because of this was seen, you could dispute this, of course, as being advantageous for the Israeli population, for Israeli interest.
So, just to emphasize the point that you're making, if you look at the list of at least, a good number of the prisoners who've been released, they include, people that, executed, bus bombings that were involved in the murder of teenagers, uh, that, coordinated shooting attacks on civilians, that recruited other terrorists to do similar things. And they're going home and they're being, celebrated. It does deserve more emphasis certainly than it's gotten in broader press coverage.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we're talking about of the 2,000 that Israel released in this deal, and of course, there are many more that were released in previous deals. 250 were people that are serving life sentences for murders that they committed before this war began, totally unrelated. So that's not really a matter of international law as much as either you could call that extortion, right, in terms of taking from Israel or from a political exigency or some form of peace or however you want to formulate it. But we are talking about people who represented in the past clear and present dangers, which is why they were imprisoned. In fact, in one of the cases, one of the prisoners that was just released was released previously in the Gilad Shalit deal. He went back and murdered an Israeli again, and now has been released a second time. And that, of course, raises a lot of questions of, well, what message are you giving over to Palestinian terrorists? And
Well,
what are they going
you right. You said actually that Jewish law traditionally tried to take into account the potentially precedential value of these sorts of trades. Although, also from what you said, it didn't really stop the community from trying to get back as many people as possible, right? Does the Western international legal regime take that kind of precedent into account? And for that matter, actually, we're talking about Hamas. We're not talking about two countries that are negotiating, as you've mentioned earlier, in a war in a more formal kind of fashion. So Does the nature of the party that you're negotiating with matter?
Oh, it matters a lot of different ways. In general, around the West, there's been this attitude of we don't negotiate with terrorists. This has been a sort of an idea that America had and many other countries have as well, Germany and UK. Although in recent years, that's been violated, that principle. In 2014, the US released 5 Taliban prisoners from Guantanamo Bay, significant figures of the Taliban, in order to bring back an American soldier who's sort of gone AWOL. And more recently, there was a prisoner exchange between the US and Russia and many other countries, actually, to bring home the Wall Street journalist, Evan Gershkovich, and others as well. And there was a lot of questions being raised if that was a wise move, because in return, there were several Western citizens who were unlawfully detained by Russia who were released. And in return, Russia got, assassins, murderers, hackers, others that Putin was interested in bringing back. And there's been a lot of questions raised. Well, what precedent does that set? Every time, Putin might want to bring back someone that's been captured, is he just going to grab some Western citizen and put a lot of pressure to bring that person home? So in the West, there's a great hesitancy to this idea. Israel, of course, has struggled with this. Really, a turning point was in 1985, what's known as the Jabril deal, in which Israel released 1,185 Palestinian and other Arab terrorists and prisoners in order to bring back 3 Israeli soldiers. And this has been sort of an ongoing debate since, with, in general, the Israeli population seemingly favoring to bring people home at all cost. But we've seen how much of a cost that is.
So, what do you think? I mean, I might be asking you to speculate too much, and you're welcome to tell me. But what do you think accounts for what you're describing, both in the West and in Israel, as a more recent push to these sorts of deals? Right? You said in 2014, America first engaged in exchanges after, with the West basically saying for a long time that they don't negotiate with terrorists, and obviously, the Shalit deal marked a very big uh, turning point. So is it just? Let me ask you before I start throwing out terminology.
I think in the Israeli context, there's a very important value of Israeli solidarity. In Hebrew, we call this Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Lezeh, that we're all responsible for each other. And I think you've seen that there's this just deep belief that Israeli solidarity depends on the idea that we never leave anyone behind. And this is, I think actually a very beautiful value in some ways, but it's become very costly because if you look at the Shalit deal, in which we brought back home one soldier who was taken captive for 5 years in not pleasant circumstances. But many of those people that were released were the masterminds behind the October 7th massacre. And we've seen this in previous deals as well, how founders and leaders of Hezbollah and Hamas and other types of terrorist groups were released in previous deals. But there is a very strong notion of solidarity, which says we just cannot bear the idea of leaving someone behind. In other cases in the West, I don't think that everyone always appreciates in the West the same type of solidarity. Israel's a smaller country. Israel also has mandatory conscription. All are required to serve in the army. And so there is this feeling that every soldier is sort of all of our children's, right? As that someone is, Haben Shalanu, right? Gilad Shalit was the children of all of us. And we see this as well. And I think in the Western countries, you don't feel that type of solidarity in the same way. But I think one of the things that have shifted today is that the power of social media and publicity makes it a lot easier to make a public cause of someone who's been taken captive. So that was certainly the case with the Wall Street Journal journalist, with Evan Gershkovich, who of course had the power of the Wall Street Journal's clout publicizing his case. And his mother made some high profile appeals to the Biden government, which quickly spread over social media and other places. So I think that's one of the factors that goes into things. And also just the knowledge that we know that when you don't bring people home, they frequently die. And that's a horrible thing. And we feel a certain sense of responsibility for our citizens and particularly for our soldiers. I mean, in the Israeli case, we did deals in the mid 80s, but we didn't do a deal to bring home Ron Arad. And a fighter pilot was shot down in 1986, and it's presumed that he died in captivity. So there are a lot of things that are weighing these types of deals and the ways that the people in West and in Israel are sort of navigating these dilemmas.
Going back to the question of price, of value of life, I'll ask one uncomfortable question and then one also uncomfortable question. I'm asking strictly just within Jewish law because we mentioned earlier, but that the value was sort of attached, God forgive me, to like a market price. Does that mean that you would distinguish between different types of civilians and let's say let's say, I don't know, a criminal versus a spiritual leader or or someone who had a family versus someone who didn't? I hate myself for even asking a question. I'm just genuinely intellectually curious as to the history here.
Yeah, so historically, there were some questions raised, would we value some prisoners more than others? Communal leaders would be particularly significant. Or, for example, would you say that a family would be allowed to spend more money on bringing home their own because they felt this obligation to their own person? And so you do have a bit of that type of conversation in historical Jewish legal discussions. But those have really been laid aside for a lot of reasons. I mean, one of which, of course, is that how do we negotiate, navigate the spiritual value of different people? It's really impossible. And just in general, I think that we feel certainly in the Israeli context, whether it's a citizen or a soldier, we have an obligation to bring those people home. I mean, in the West, there's this belief that soldiers sometimes are meant to kill and be killed. They've sort of lost their rights to life in certain ways, which I think is a foreign concept in Jewish law, who sees our soldiers as members of our own and as agents of our own people. All the more so, then we have an obligation to bring them back. So, I don't think that we have that type of distinction. And in fact, in Jewish law, developed the idea that, sometimes people get taken captivity because of their fault. I mean, they made a mistake or they're doing some criminal act. And yet we still said that we should do what we can to bring that person back home. So there is seen as having a some form of moral obligation even in those circumstances. That said, though, of course, the value of not encouraging hostage taking is very, very, very real, and it's something which I think, my own personal belief is that we need to think about this very deeply right now in the context of Israel and other places in the West as well. I mean, we're making deals that we sort of understand are going to cost many lives in the future. I mean, if you take the deal we just did right now, and again, I don't want to get into the wisdom of the deal. There might be a lot of
Right. We can't now.
we can right now. It's too fresh, and we're all happy that these hostages are home. And I was crying every time I saw these videos, and a lot
I
of
think
tears.
everybody in Israel has had like a tissue just in hand
Yes, yes,
the
and I
entire
caught
time.
myself once without a tissue, and I was just crying in public, just like one of those moments, right? So,
Yeah.
and I'm happy. I'm happy that they're home, full stop, like I'm just happy about that. But,
Sure.
you sort of make a utilitarian calculation, which is uncomfortable to do, and you say we brought home 20 people. It's a beautiful thing. But how many people are going to be murdered by all of these terrorists that were just released and that we know now from experience go back to committing terror? And by the way, some of the hostage families even were raising that factor throughout and saying
Yeah.
that, that's a consideration. So Tzvika Moore is the most prominent, the father of the hostage Eitan Moore, but others as well. And, I think that's a painful conversation which we really, really need to have right now. We should have had that after the Shalit deal. And in fact, the leader of the opposition at the time, who's still a member of Knesset by name of Yair Lapid, who's also now the leader of the opposition, went out and said, we should pass a law that you cannot make lopsided trades. And that's really the problematic part. It's not the trades per se, it's how lopsided they are, how many people are releasing. And he said, we need to have a law against this. And that law never got passed. And come October 8th, Yair Lapid gets up and says, "We gotta bring them all home, whatever it takes." We really need to have this conversation.
I mean, is there anybody who's, um, I guess, articulating it's not even really a hard line view. It's just a harder thing to say, articulating the notion that these things should be either off the table or really minimized.
I mean, I think you see a little bit of these voices in the current Israeli government, from figures like, Bezalel Smotrich or Itamar Ben-Gvir. They've sort of made those points a little bit in some of their parties.
And then it's
Um,
kind of caught as a right-wing talking point instead of a serious that in, more general press. That can be the way
Absolutely.
it's
It becomes
perceived,
very
yeah.
problematic. At the beginning of the war, this professor in Israel by the name of Yedidia Stern, who's not seen as being part of the Israeli right, sort of in the center, and used to be
Yeah,
part of the
some
Israel
center
left, whatever it is,
yeah.
Israel Democracy Institute, whatever it might be. Happens to be a friend of mine, someone I like, and he wrote several op-eds just saying, like, we cannot make those types of deals again. And, he was highly criticized in a lot of his circles in many ways for those op-eds, but he felt very passionately, we need to be smarter about this. And it's pretty clear that people like Sinwar, who have studied Israeli society well, realize that this is our Achilles heel. And so we are just creating over and over again Achilles heel, and there needs to be a collective conversation which says that, we need to change this calculation. We cannot allow this to be encouraged. It's interesting. Israel did establish a committee, as Israel always seems to do after the Shalit deal, about these prisoner swaps. But the findings were kept confidential for whatever reason. I'm not really sure why. But one of the factors that did come out publicly was the belief that the families of the hostages should not have direct contact with the government and should be sort of separated from the government calculations. That was clearly not the case in the
No, of course
circumstance
not.
now. And in many ways, that politicized the whole issue in very uncomfortable ways that really, I think, has impacted the feelings of Israeli solidarity and is very, very, very bad ramifications. So it's a very critical conversation we really need to have at this stage.
Let me drag you to one more part of the conversation. Minor, but it also crops up again in the context of value of life price that we pay. Um, the no man left behind extends as well to our deceased. So we're releasing, um, the kinds of problematic characters that we've talked about with blood on their hands, in return for the bodies of our people. And again, I think at this point the conversation is quite clear on the fact that, at least strictly in terms of the way that Jewish law might view these things, right? It's a much more complex picture than we've allowed for. But I wonder where that even figures in. Like, what did we in the past? Are there historical examples of the Jewish community also trying to retrieve
Yeah,
deceased?
there is a notion of mitzvah in Hebrew, it's called, which says that when someone is not being buried, right, the community has this obligation to do what it takes to get that person buried. And, that's part of our belief in the sanctity of the body and of the corpse and our respect for their human dignity, that we want to get people to be buried properly. That's one of the things we do as Jews. But, you have to that's a important mitzvah, but it's not like the level of saving someone's life who's actually alive, and I think we have to be very, very careful about such exchanges. I mean, depending how you understood the most recent exchange, you could have formulated, well, the live prisoners were, sort of released to bring home the living hostages, and then we return some, like, 300 bodies, I think, of Palestinians, but although not the Sinwars, by the way, in order to bring back, although that hasn't been successful yet, it's supposedly to bring back all of the dead hostages. But in past prisoner exchanges, we would release really murderers in order to bring back home dead soldiers like Goldwasser and Regem that we did that were kidnapped and killed and kidnapped in Lebanon several years ago. I find that highly problematic. I find it highly problematic to say that we're going to risk, future lives in order to bring a person home to be buried. I don't want to minimize the importance of bringing people home to be buried. I was at the funeral of, Daniel Perez, who was returned, who was killed
Of
on
course.
October 7th, and friendly with his parents, and it was deeply moving to have him brought home to what we call Kever Yisrael, to be buried in Israeli land and to be buried in Har Herzl like he should be, right? But the idea of releasing people who are alive, terrorists who can go back to murder and cause someone else's funeral. right? In order to bring someone home for their burial, to risk someone else's funeral, I think doesn't make a lot of sense, and I certainly don't think it's mandated under Jewish law.
So you've raised a few times that there needs to be a serious conversation about this. Clearly, there needs to be. I think going into the war of the past couple of years, it felt initially like it was less likely that we would be in this situation again, making these kinds of hard decisions because it was so clear uh, that there were costs to pay at a massive level, and yet here we are. Uh, Let me just ask you what form that conversation takes, right? You, for instance, are incredibly active in the educational and teaching and writing space. Um, I highly encourage anybody who can to learn with Rabbi Brody. Is there a real discussion happening in the Jewish like halachic space? Is there politically? We've mentioned that it seems to be kind of sidelined within the right at the moment. Is there something in the press? Is where does this conversation happen now, if at all, and where does it need to take place?
I mean, I think unfortunately right now it's happening mostly in halachic circles actually, where there's a
It is.
very, deep debate on this issue and it continues to be. But in the Israeli public, that hasn't really translated into Israeli public. And the truth is, I think a lot of people get the issues at hand. People understand the risks that are involved here. And, I think when you spoke to some of the sophisticated advocates for the families of the hostages who were very open and said, listen, we recognize the future risks of these deals, but we have a short term immediate need that needs to be resolved. And I don't, I don't dismiss that consideration whatsoever. I mean, I think for those lives and for the purpose of Israeli solidarity, that's important. But we really need a bipartisan type of conversation, which is not being driven by religion or the right or whatever it might be, but just by driven by everyone who are Zionists and care about these issues. And to sit down and say, okay, we understand the risk of these deals. It's going to happen again. I mean, we just should recognize the fact that we've been doing this now for 40 something years. It is going to happen again, according to, God forbid, I say, I don't want to bring that upon us. God forbid it should happen. But according to all regular political calculations, that's going to happen. We need to be ready for that next moment. And, I'll tell you, one of my kids asked me in the midst of this, what would
Mhm.
you do if I was taken captive?
Oh my God.
Right. So that was a that was a fun drive home. And but I said to him right away, I said, listen, I would do everything to bring you back
Yep.
because and I'll tell you why, not just because that's what the duty of a parent is, because no one should be feel like a sucker saying like, "Oh, we're gonna like sacrifice my kid and not make deals now." Like it only makes sense to rethink this as a policy level if we actually have this as a national conversation. And if we actually change the national conversation and set standards, which I think ultimately have to be put into law, then we can actually hopefully prevent the future captivity. And if there is, God forbid, another captive, prevent a future lopsided deal because it's sort of taken off the table. And that's something we have to establish. I mean, it was horrible already October 8th. It was just a given that Israel is going to be willing to release so many terrorists to bring our people home. That can't be a given anymore.
Understood. Well, I hope that that conversation expands. I hope that you take an active role in expanding it. You're an important voice, and I really appreciate your time. Hope to talk to you about other topics, perhaps happier topics in the future.
Thank you so much for this important conversation.